So, what I've kind of termed fundamentals of SDM, trying to build on the last session that was more theoretically about niches and distributions to ask, well, what are we actually trying to do with these models? Whatever the particular application may be, or whatever the particular method might be, what are we trying to do with these models? So this is where we left off before we had coffee. We talked about geographic space. We talked about environmental space. We talked about what we already know. The only thing that we know are the species occurrence records, and then these concepts of actual distributions, occupied niche space, abiotically suitable area, fundamental niche, etc. So I'm going to take that same diagram, conceptual diagram, and start thinking about what we do with a distribution model, with an idealized distribution model. Okay? When we actually do this, it's not so straightforward, but this is the basic idea of what we're trying to do. Okay? So we start in geographic space because that's what we have. We know something about the occurrence records of the species. That's all we know. We then input that into our model, which mostly, you'll find exceptions in the literature, and there are different ways of doing this, but mostly the models occupy, or the models function, in environmental space. They're trying to build up this relationship. What's the probability of the species occurring given a set of environmental conditions? Okay, it's not about geography, it's not about space. So there are some models that will feed in spatial coordinates as well, and that's a category of model, but it's not the vast majority of models. Okay, so same as here, same as on the last slide. These are our occurrence records. This is our actual distribution. The actual niche space that's occupied, and then this is our kind of fundamental niche. What we try to do with the model that is kind of illustrated here with this big, thick black line, what we're going to try and do is characterize that space that the species occurs in. So we're going to kind of try to draw a box or draw a shape around those occurrence records. All right? That's all our model is. Now, our model might fit very closely to those points. It might be broader. It might not be very good. It might leave some of the records out. Okay, but ideally, we would build a nice model that fits conceptually around our points, and that's our ecological niche model. And then what we're going to do is project it back once we build the model, whatever form that might take. It might be a Maxent model, a regression model, some machine learning approach, whatever. We're going to project that back into geographic space. So what's that going to give us? Again, our thick black lines are trying to illustrate conceptually the kinds of predictions that you are likely to get from that model. So in environmental space, notice that the model doesn't actually capture the occupied niche space in this case, in this conceptual case. Okay? It just fits around the known occurrence records. And it certainly doesn't actually give you an estimate of the full fundamental niche of the species. It just fits about those localities that we have, those occurrence records that we have. So if those occurrence records were from a very different species that had a very different distribution and environmental space, they sampled the environmental space different, you might get a better estimate of what the fundamental niche of the species is, if you had localities that were spread much throughout the fundamental niche. If the occupied niche matched the fundamental niche much more closely, then you might build a model that more accurately estimates the fundamental niche. But the reality is, in most cases, it's going to be something like depicted here. So we project that back into geographic space. What are the kinds of predictions that we're likely to end up with? Okay, so one type of prediction is geographically we would hope that we could characterize those known occurrence records. All right, that's our kind of prediction of the known distribution of the species. Okay, we're just going to build a model that kind of says we'd hope to draw a line around, we'd hope to characterize those areas where the species actually is known to occur. But that's not all the model is going to kind of predict, okay? It's going to predict these other kinds of distributions. So we would hopefully come up with potentially this kind of distribution here. It's numbered 2 here from the right up. That's a prediction from the model that's saying that, in effect, the conditions at this locality are similar to within the niche of the species, right? And there's another case here. This might be conceptually saying that, up here there is some conditions geographically that satisfy the distribution or satisfy the requirements for the species environmentally, ecologically. So what kind of things might these models be useful for? Well, this prediction 2, can anybody think what might that kind of prediction be useful for? We don't have any occurrence records from there, but actually, remember this was trying to depict the actual distribution of the species, shaded in grey. What might that prediction be useful for?
Find new populations.
To find new populations, right? If you went out there and sampled here, you would hopefully find new populations of the species. We don't have any occurrence records there right now. Okay? And we'll talk about these kinds of applications in more detail, but what might prediction 3 be useful for? So this is an area where the species doesn't actually occur, right? Conceptually, because we've not shaded it in grey. Okay, so it doesn't actually occur there, but the model is saying, well, the environments are suitable for the species to occur there. So as was point made down here, this might be an area where a translocation, if you were looking to do a reintroduction of a species, you're looking for suitable habitats that might not be currently occupied. There you go. What about invasive species? Think about our BAM diagram of movement restricting the distribution, and if we increased the ability of species to move around the landscape, think potentially there's a big geographic barrier here. If this species becomes breaks down this movement restriction and occupies this area, that might be a locality where the species is more likely to expand and spread, right? So there are these different types of predictions that you're going to expect to get from the different types of models. From the models, you're going to get these different types of predictions. Make sense? Let's crack on. So this is kind of the headline thing that I've put in bold in red because it's so important. Ecological niche models or species distribution models, whatever you want to call them, they identify areas in a landscape that have similar environments to localities where the species has been observed. Nothing more and nothing less. Is it the niche? Is it the distribution? Well, it's going to depend on the particular circumstance that you're working with, but that fundamentally is what you are doing when you draw your output. That is what your output is telling you. It's up to you and your application and your input to do analyses on top of that, to interpret that correctly, to draw some interesting conclusions. But it's not going to give you a model of the distribution or of the fundamental niche or of the realized niche. That's all it's going to do. It's going to tell you areas in the landscape that have environments that are similar to where you've already observed the species. But that's useful. And what we're going to focus on through the next couple of days are this series of applications that we've begun to touch on that use exactly that information in all these different areas. Okay? But first, a few kind of words of caution in terms of uses and misuses. First thing, if you put garbage in, you're going to get garbage out. All right, that's the old adage that's relevant to distribution modelling, to any type of modelling really. If the data that you're putting in doesn't tell you what you think it does, then you're not going to get good information out. So in our case, if the occurrence records that you use to build this type of distribution modelling, if they don't provide useful information about the requirements of the species, then the model can't provide useful output. Remember, the very first thing that we started with before coffee was this fundamental assumption when we were contrasting correlative with mechanistic approaches, that we are assuming that the occurrence records that you have tell you something useful about the requirements ecologically the requirements of the species, right? So, in the majority of cases, the occurrence records that you have are probably going to do that, but we can brainstorm many cases, and we see it in data sets that people are trying to publish in that, where that's just not the case, right? So if you put garbage in, you'll get garbage out, and this is kind of relevant as well. I sometimes refer to it like the lure of complicated technology. Like, we tend to use complex computational technologies, genetic algorithms, artificial neural networks. It's all very cool. Huge databases of environmental data, WorldClim data at really fine resolution, remote sensing data from NASA is very cool. God, it must be correct. I've presented these results, in forums with more kind of applied conservation audience, trying to get across recommendations and how they can use these methods. And often, the response is, this is really cool, it's so cool, terabytes of data, fancy machine learning algorithms, and there's therefore an unfounded trust in the model. Okay? So all I'm just trying to do is emphasize that the models can only be as good as the theoretical underpinnings that we're kind of laboring this morning for good reason, because it's just so important and we see it go wrong so many times, and you don't want to do that in the thesis and your things that you're trying to publish. If the fundamentals, if the ecology, if your understanding of niches, if the theory isn't right, then you can throw terabytes of fancy data at it, you can throw some amazing machine learning algorithms at it, but still you're not going to get anything useful come out. All right? Another thing to beware of, and this is quite crucial, we'll talk about this particularly in terms of climate change, is a classic for this. Model extrapolation. So extrapolation in its most general sense is in effect making predictions beyond the range of what you've calibrated a model for. So you calibrate a model within a particular sphere, within a particular set of conditions. When you then project kind of outside that set of conditions, then you are extrapolating with the model. And it's kind of dangerous, okay? But to put that very realistically, but we do it all the time, but to think about that we're going to start talking about kind of response curves and things like that over the next few sessions. So what I mean by that is, this is, say, the suitability, the habitat suitability of a species. So this is, it's not very low, and this is that it's really suitable. And then this is our some environmental dimension. So that might be temperature or precipitation or pH or whatever. And then, so this is just in one ecological dimension. What we're trying to, in effect, often do with these models is kind of plot a response curve. We're trying to ask what does this could say probability of occurrence, but how does the suitability change with the change in that environment? So what you'll often find is a kind of bell-shaped curve. It's very unsuitable down here and it gets too cold, and then you have this peak where most of the species is most commonly found in mid, where it's between a certain range of temperatures or precipitations, and then it gets too hot or too cold. And what we're often trying to do in these methods is estimate the form of that relationship. So again, if you run maxent models or if you're doing regression-based approaches, a lot of these methods allow you to actually visualize what those response curves look like. And we're going to look at some later on. But again, theoretically, fundamentally, we're trying to characterize how the species responds to the environment. But if the kind of zone that you're parameterizing the model is this gray area here, so you build a response curve that looks like this. Say you have some this is 10 degrees and this is 20 degrees C, so you're modeling a species in a particular region and you build this nice response curve. That's the range of environments that you calibrate the model for, that you build the model for. That's the range of conditions that you have some confidence in. Well, we know how the species is responding, all right? We can do that. But then what happens outside that? What happens when the temperature gets a bit hotter and we're trying to estimate in 50 years' time where the species is likely to be? Well, suddenly we don't know, right? What form does that response curve take in this area where we're extrapolating, where it gets hotter than the models were parameterized for example? Okay? So we have to be very aware of that. This is where if you have more mechanistic approaches, if you have a more mechanistic understanding of the species niche, how it responds to the environment, then you're probably going to have a better record. You've grown in the greenhouse your species and you know it dies when it gets too hot. But if you parameterize your model and you don't include those conditions where it's really hot, then it becomes pretty much guesswork. Okay? And there are ways to think about this and ways to deal with it. One way, for example, is that what we often do if we're thinking about climate change is we'll build models over a really large area. Say we're interested in climate change impacts in the UK. What we might do is build a model for the whole of Europe where we include a much broader range of conditions than are currently found in the UK. So we'll ask whether that species also occurs in the south of France, in Portugal and Spain. We'll characterize these response curves, but then we'll just project within the UK. And by doing so, we're asking, well, in the UK in 50 years' time, actually the temperature is going to be going to be kind of similar to what it currently is in the south of France. So we have some estimate of what the species is doing under those conditions. So we kind of use space as a proxy for time. I'll mention that a little bit when we talk about climate change impacts. In fact, I'll mention it this afternoon. But all I want to do for now is just flag this issue. When you're extrapolating beyond the range of conditions that you parameterize the model for, it becomes an element of guesswork, and you need to be very, very careful of that. Okay? What form does that response curve take? What we want to do is build models that characterize the full kind of response curve for the species, and then we can have more confidence when we project them. Or we want to know exactly what the model is doing when it is extrapolating. Okay? So some methods, it's very difficult to work out what's going on here. Other methods, particularly like the regression methods or something where you really have an equation, you know what the model is doing, you can at least understand what kind of prediction the model is making. Is it going to just, this is a common response, this is what maxent does by default, it just clamps is the term, it just keeps the response the same as it was at the edge of the conditions that you calibrated the model for. Clamping in maxent. But again, that's getting to specifics. What I want to flag now is this is something you need to be very aware of for your applications. All right? So this is something, just to finish with for now, this is a flow diagram that we're going to keep coming back to that kind of sets out the main kinds of steps that you're going to go through when building these models. And again, doesn't matter which model that you are doing, I'm trying to make this as generic as possible. But what we're going to do is start going through these different steps. So let's step back and think about the overall thing, and you'll see there's 2 slides here, so it continues, but stick. So what we start with is some sort of, what we're going to do is collate some sort of database of environmental conditions. Okay? So these might be temperature, this might be precipitation. These are the environmental variables that we've talked about. And there are any number of sources, and I'll flag some of them this afternoon to go away and find. But we're going to come up with a database of environmental variables. The other thing that we're going to do is come up with some occurrence records. And we're going to talk about where you might get them, and we've already touched on some of the nuances about what those records mean. It might be records where the species has been observed. It might also be records where the species is known to be absent. And we'll talk about those. But remember, these are fundamentally the 2 things we need. We need to know something about the distribution, and we need to know something about the environment. There's another step that I've thrown in here, which is kind of key, and this comes back to one of the comments that was made. What we often do is process those kind of raw environmental data, those raw layers, things like temperature and precipitation, to generate variables that we think are important for the species. So in your application, don't just grab some data and use that. Be thinking sensibly, be thinking biologically, ecologically. What actually are the variables that control the distribution, and can I come up with variables that, are as close to what I want as possible? So you might mine some databases that have classic is monthly, people tend to record monthly, in some region that you're interested in, monthly temperature records. Okay, and you might have 20 years of monthly temperature, you know what it's like, January, February, March, etc., through the year. but then there's probably some processing that you want to go through to actually generate the variables that are interest. So what might be of interest would be, well, actually, how hot does it get during the year? So you might be mining that database and actually coming up with a variable which is, you know, the hottest temperature that it reaches during the year. How cold does it get? How many days is it below a certain threshold? How many days is it above a certain threshold? If you're interested in plant growth, there's a classic variable, growing degree days. It's in effect an index of counting the number of days that you're above some baseline that will allow you to, you know, allow the plant to grow in effect. So there's often a step that you need to think about that's what are the actual variables that are important, you know, before you actually do the modelling. So you'll immediately be seeing that, you know, the actual, say, building a model, running the algorithm, getting an output is just this, it's usually the shortest thing that you do. It's this tiny little thing. Everyone thinks, oh, I do maxent modelling. Well, actually, that's just this little algorithm that you do to build the relationship. But the whole skill and the whole process is this selecting data, generating layers that are important, etc. I'll give you an example of soil water on a later slide. Then this is what we often think about as the modelling. This is where we actually apply the algorithm. This is where we have to select a sensible algorithm for what we're trying to do. It might be maxent, it might be an artificial neural network, a regression approach, a boosted regression tree, etc., etc., etc. There are dozens of methods out there. Okay? So that's where you take your data and you actually build your model. Depending on the method that you use, you're going to do some sort of model calibration. Okay? And for different algorithms, the different parameters that you might parameterize are different, but you need to go through that process. It's usually bad practice to just take the defaults that you have in, say, maxent or something. You want to be thinking and parameterizing for your application, for your species, for your data set. How can I understand this model? How can I best parameterize it to get the best performance from the model? So, for example, with maxent, there is a parameter called regularization, which affects how tightly you fit your model to your distribution. What it really does is affect how complicated, how complex your response curves can be. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that in a minute. But so if you're using that model, don't just take the defaults. You should be calibrating your model for your data and your application and understanding that model. So I'm including that as a separate step. You select your algorithm, you apply it, but then you're actually parameterizing the model. And there's some back and forth here of selecting what parameters you should use. All right, next step. So we've got to the point of asking, we've got the data, we built a model, you know, that's our kind of conceptually some species probability of occurring is some function of the environment. Then what do we do with that? Well, next thing that we do is map it in geographic space. Right? We build the model in environmental space and then we plot it back geographically. We basically say for every cell in the landscape, it's cell-based as we talked about, at a certain resolution, is this cell, okay, so this cell has this suite of conditions, so what's the probability of the species occurring there based on our model? And you just apply that across every cell in the landscape. So you come up with a prediction across the landscape of geographically what's the distribution of suitabilities. And that's often seen, you know, that's your species distribution model. That's your ecological niche model. All right? Then what are you going to do that? Well, the first thing is you're going to say, well, is it any good? Do I have some sort of predictive performance here? Do I meet some criteria that I need to be able to use this model? Or is it just giving me nonsense output? So that's where, once you've made your prediction, you're going to test the performance of the model by evaluating the predictive performance. And we'll talk about this afternoon different ways that you can evaluate the predictive performance. But whenever you're putting this in a thesis or in a paper, presenting it to a practitioner or whatever, you need to present some evaluation statistics. It'll get chucked back pretty quickly by a journal or by an examination committee or whatever if you're not testing how good your model is. Okay, so that's when we start thinking about things like AUC curves and things like that you may have heard of, and we'll talk about this afternoon. So hopefully we cross this hurdle that we have some good predictive performance. So what we're going to do is actually apply the model. So this is where, this might be our output here, this might be our ultimate goal, but we might be interested in, say, predicting the distribution in a different region. If you're interested in, say, an invasive species, you might be asking, I'm going to give you an example of plants that are native to South Africa. What happens if you project them to California? So you build the model for South Africa and then you project it to California. So you might be predicting in a different region, or you might be predicting in a different time period. Like you might be asking, well, where's this distribution, or where's this niche going to be geographically in, say, 50 years' time? But it's the same fundamental model. It's just that you're applying it in space or in time. And then you can do other cool things, like in particular you can maybe test the predictive performance against actual observed data. So what we're doing here is really just testing how good our performance is of the present day prediction of the region that we're studying, in Madagascar or in Europe or wherever. Then when we project that to a different region, we might actually be asking, well, can we evaluate the performance of the model in that new region? So in the case study that I will show you for South Africa, invasive species from South Africa projected to, say, California, then you get some records from California where the species is invading, and ask, is the model predicting the areas where the species is actually invading? So that's a kind of next step evaluation of the predictive performance, not just in the study where you're calibrating the model, but also you can do this kind of testing, say, in an invaded region. You can also do that temporally. Okay, so some studies of, say, modeled distributions from the 1970s and then projected them to the present day, and then asked whether the present day data matches where you thought it would have been if you'd just used the data from the 1970s. So we'll talk a bit about this, but in the general steps, that's another cool thing that you can do.